007, your licence to kill is being revoked due to crimes against swordsmanship. Please surrender your fencing breeches to Q and leave the building immediately.
Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and of course here we're looking at that famous sword fight from Die Another Day, the 007 film from 2002. I'll be your host for this. I'm Matt Easton, fencing instructor, antique sword dealer and YouTuber of course, and this fight in Die Another Day has come under a lot of flack over the years from fencers, historical fencers, martial artists and all sorts, because there are some truly awful things in it, and we're going to look at those here. There are a few good things as well, and I'm going to highlight those as well. So this isn't just going to be completely panning this fight. You know, it is fun, and I'll come back to that point at the end. Before I go on, I want to thank the sponsors for this video, and this video is coming to you only thanks to them, and that is Raid Shadow Legends. As you almost certainly know by now, raids are hugely popular, mobile and PC-based, turn-based fantasy combat game. I've got some shards. Let's summon some new characters. Ooh, the Necro Hunter. Oh, it's a 4-star. Very nice. I know you guys have heard loads about Raid Shadow Legends by now, but you know what? It's a really hugely popular game and it's absolutely free to play. I downloaded it for free and I play for free. It is genuinely pretty tactical. Which champions you choose, how you play, for the mission at hand, or just generally for your playing style. Here you can see my sparring pit, which is where I'm training up my favourite champions. Most people play on their mobile phones or cell phones of course, but you can also play it on your PC. Within the last couple of weeks they've added a load of new updates, and there's a lot to mention, so I'll just dive straight in. Firstly, they've just added champion fragments, which let you collect pieces of champions that you can use to summon specific awesome new champions, with special events running all the time. There's also the new Bazaar, where you can load up on high value items and the gold bars that you win in Tag Arena, and they just extended the daily login rewards up to 270 days, with free champions available just for logging in. It's been a crazy month for updates, so there's never been a better time to start. So go to the video description, click on the special links there, and if you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver and one free champion called the Channeler. You can access these rewards up here in the inbox, which looks like a treasure chest. These rewards are available only for the next 30 days and only for new players. So thanks very much for sticking with us. Now let's get back to this movie fight review, having a look at Die Another Day. Pierce Brosnan versus Toby Stephens. This happens in the Blades Club, which is sort of in the middle of the film, and it's quite an iconic fight, I suppose, that's been even used in music videos, which I won't go into in this video. But there are some, as I say, there are some good things about it and some bad things. We're probably going to be focusing mostly on the bad, but I have to be honest, there are some good things in there. And then when I've been asked to review this, I have of course seen the film before, but I haven't reviewed this fight before. And I've been asked by many of my viewers on my channel, and I do other movie fight reviews. If you haven't checked those out, then check out my playlist on the channel. But when I've been asked to review this fight, I have always heard about it as in a negative light. And I have to be honest, when I went to make this video and when I actually went and broke down the fight and looked at it scene by scene, as it were, cut by cut, actually there are some things in there which are actually commendable. And overall, I must say that I do think the fight's kind of fun. So let's have a little bit of a look at this fight and actually look at some of the details of the good and the bad. Now first up we see Bond fencing against Graves, his opponent, with modern fencing weapons, épées they seem to be, and I have to say that I think that both the fencers in this case are probably doubles. I don't think they're the actual actors themselves, they keep their masks on during the actual fighting, and I have to say there's nothing really you know, constructive or useful or negative that I can say about this. It looks like fairly standard, straightforward modern fencing, épée fencing, and I don't have anything constructive to say about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight on to the use of the, shall we say, the real swords or the military swords that comes after this initial part of the bout.
First blood drawn from the torso.
So what are these real swords that they go for? Well, very interestingly, and I have to say actually for sword aficionados, this is actually quite a nice touch. They go for 1897 pattern British infantry officers' swords. Now, these were almost certainly modern made at the time. This is an antique from the time of World War I, but the pattern has remained exactly the same. So since 1897, right up to the modern day, and obviously they're only used for parade purposes and ceremonial purposes these days, hence they often get referred to as ceremonial swords. These days, but initially in 1897 and up until the Boer War and even up until World War I, swords were still occasionally used, and moreover they were regarded as weapons. So this model of sword, the 1897 pattern sword, whilst it might look to some of you like initially you may have thought it was a fencing sabre, a modern fencing sabre, it's very much not that, and it is it's a 1 inch broad blade at the base that tapers down to a point, and it is a stiff blade that is designed primarily for thrusting. Now that's important to this fight because actually in this fight they principally cut with the swords. Now this is something that you will see as a recurring theme through movie stage choreography, and particularly through the fights that I review. I will often mention this, that they are cutting a lot more than perhaps they should for the sword type and not thrusting using the point enough. And that's the case here. And why is that? Well, quite simply because cutting big wide movements are easier for a normal audience to understand and interpret. It looks more dramatic, it looks more bellicose and warlike and fighty to most people's eyes. And most people, it's almost certainly one of the reasons why modern fencing is not a popular spectator sport, can't really understand what's going on with the fine movements sometimes of point work. So even when we look at films where something like a rapier or a small sword, if it's Zorro or a musketeer movie, is the principal weapon, which should be thrusting almost all of the time, or at least most of the time in the case of rapiers, we often find that they are used to cut a lot more than to thrust, and this is incorrect historically speaking. And this is also true in this fight scene. The protagonists use precisely these swords, and some people would call these sabres because of the style of guard. I call it a sword because it's straight and principally a thrusting weapon in this case. They use them principally to cut, and that is an error, but I understand why they did it. But just so that you're aware, this type of sword is a real military sword, was used at the time of various campaigns of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, used in Afghanistan, South Africa, India, and this was still used in World War I. There are some cases of these being used in World War I as well. So these were real military swords, but used principally to thrust. Can they be used for cutting with? Yes, they can, and there is in fact a manual for the use of these by Ferdinand Masiello from 1895, and indeed there are cuts in there, but the cuts are secondary to the thrust, so it's principally a thrusting weapon, and you would cut when the opportunity arises, but you wouldn't usually expect that to be an incapacitating thing. Usually you would be thrusting to kill with that point. Now, another criticism that I will make of this fight, which I make of many movie fights, and again I understand the reasons for doing this, but is basically the lack of lunging. Well, what is a lunge? A lunge is, if you look at modern fencing, this was exactly the same done in 17th, 18th, 19th century fencing as well, to the death or for duels of honour, where the front leg is cast out, the back leg extends straight, so that the person reaches forward to hit, and then they do what's called a recovery. So you lunge and you recover. This means that you're moving into hitting distance, or you're moving into the dangerous range, and you're moving back out again as quickly and simply as possible with one extension and one recovery. And that's the lunge and recover. Now, in movie fights, very often when they should be lunging and recovering, They don't. They tend to scurry around, gather around, so moving both their feet like they're running around, and they tend to do lots of cuts and parries and sometimes thrusts, so as I've mentioned, they don't thrust enough. They do lots of actions of the sword, shall we call it, in hitting range. And this is technically wrong, and this is bad practice in actual real military or historical swordsmanship. You should move in and hit and then come back out again, so that if they want to riposte or reply with their own attack, they have to lunge at you to get you. And one of the big advantages of this is this gives you time in order to get your guard or your parry into the right place. Now obviously in staged choreography, they've practiced all the moves, so this isn't an issue because they know what's coming next. They know the blow that's coming next. So for stage choreography cinematic purposes, they want to make the swords move as quickly as possible. So they stand in range, they don't worry about the time it takes to perform a lunge and a recovery. They stand in range and they bam, 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 bam. They exchange the blows which they've practiced for hours on end. It's a sequence that they know that's going to pan out, they know exactly how it's going to happen, and they move the swords as quickly as possible because it looks good on the screen. And there's another cinematic purpose for that as well, because it means that they are contained within camera shot. One of the problems with lunge and recover is that you would be moving into, you'd have to have a much wider frame, or you'd have the actors moving into and out of camera shot, which wouldn't work at all on screen. Having the actors closer to each other and flurrying their swords looks better on the screen. So I understand why they've done it, but you must know, if you're watching this video, you should take away from this that one of the things they don't do enough of here, not to say they don't do it at all, they do it some of the time, but they don't do enough of, is the lunge and the recover. And the difference between what you see here and what you would see in a real fight with sabers or swords would be lunge and recover, or moving into and out of distance. No! Oh no, I can't believe they went for that cliche. That's right, apparently these swords made of steel, these are made of hardened and tempered steel. Apparently these can be cut through by these swords, also made of hardened and tempered steel. Oh my god, this trope will not go away. The idea that katanas can cut through other swords, they can cut through armor, they can cut through gun barrels, they can cut through tanks, they can cut through the earth. What can't they cut through? Oh my god. It's really frustrating that they pulled a katana out, didn't really use it for anything except for cutting through another sword and then smashing a glass cabinet. Well, obviously any sword can smash a glass cabinet, someone's fist can smash a glass cabinet, but cutting through another sword, can a katana, doesn't matter whether it's a modern replica which is actually made of better steel, or whether it's a 16th or 17th century original, can it cut through a 19th century or modern steel sword? No, it can't. Do swords break? Yes, they do. And we have to accept, we're going to be looking at the longsword in a bit, but we have to accept that in historical combat, swords, be they katanas, be they sabers or longswords or anything else, do sometimes break. And that's due to various factors. It can be work hardening, fatigue, a chip in the edge that magnifies the force, the fact that it's been struck or thrust to a point where you've reached its breaking point. Yes, absolutely, swords do break. So can one sword snap through another sword? Sometimes. Yes, it can happen. But here, they've made a very specific decision to have a katana cut through another sword. And there are no historically documented cases of this ever happening. And in modern tests, it's never been done because it can't be done. One is a hardened piece of steel, and the other is a hardened piece of steel. Can a hard, sharp piece of steel cut through tatami mats or a piece of wood or, straw bale, fruit, vegetables? Yes, it can, but not a piece of steel. The fact is they are both sharpened bits of steel. Now, just in case you are interested in going into this a little bit deeper, I do have other videos on my channel. If you search for the word katana, then you will find videos talking about some of these myths and trying to redress some of those. I'm not going to go too far in the other direction because some people say that katanas are rubbish. In fact, historical katanas, because of the way they are edge quenched, are sometimes harder at the edge than spring-tempered European swords are. But we're not talking about much. We're talking about maybe 60 Rockwell on a historical katana and maybe 50 Rockwell on a historical European sword. Not enough to be able to cut through it. So I was really annoyed to see that in this fight. But what I will say is I was happy to see that the katana wasn't used much after that. I don't know why I'm happy about that. I guess just because they've just done something so ridiculous with the katana, I was happy to see it discarded and replaced by something else as quickly as possible. Longswords. So first of all, I have to say I was quite happy to see that longswords got featured. They could have stuck with katanas, they could have had the rest of the fight with katanas, or any of the other weapons that were available in that particular rather nice looking club, I have to say. I wish my fencing club looked like that. But the fact is that they duked pretty much the whole rest of the fight out with longswords. So I was kind of happy to see that longswords got featured. But man, oh man, there are some issues with how those longswords were used, and this is principally why people I know and people who communicate with me and people on forums and pages on the internet that I visit moan about this fight so much and why they hate it so much, is because of how poorly longswords are represented in this fight. I have to say, the sabres or the swords, and certainly the epées, were not badly represented in this fight overall, and I thought the fight was fun. But really, especially as the longsword is the last sword featured in this fight, it's really a big letdown. And there are a number of things which I'm going to go through that are wrong here with how they use them. But one of those things that I think will strike most people who watch this, strike, there's a pun there, is how heavy they look. There's this pervasive idea that all other swords, which are a bar of steel, if it's a katana or it's a Persian shamshir, or if it's a Chinese dao, or it's a rapier or a saber, then somehow you can move these around quickly, and these are light swords that you can fight with. Like most fighting weapons, they have to be light enough to be used deftly. But somehow medieval longswords were heavier, like they were made of some heavier type of metal, like lead or something. Ironically, in this fight, it's not so much that the actors move them particularly slowly. And in actual fact, there are some bits of the longsword fight where they actually move the swords relatively quickly, which is good. But the point is that the actors are acting the weight. Now, I've taught actors. I've also been present at stage choreography courses and this kind of stuff. And I know that this is something that is taught to actors, that certain swords, they've got to act the weight. Why can't, you're holding that sword. Why don't you just use that sword? Why do you need to act extra weight into it? Oh, here I've got a 3-pound sword. But, I really think that medieval people would have moved this like it was a 6 or 8-pound sword, so, or even more, maybe 15 pounds. So I'm going to act like it's really, really heavy, even though I'm actually holding one and it's not that heavy. It's infuriating. So that is, there are other things to criticise about the longsword fight, but that has to be the number one, is that they use the longswords, or they move their bodies in a way like they're now using really heavy, cumbersome, brutish swords, when they're not. They're actually just using the European version of a katana. So the next most annoying thing about the way they use the longswords is they use them like they're a giant heavy stick, or maybe a sledgehammer. They seem to think that, oh, I've got a weapon here which has got 2 edges and a point. So how am I going to use it? I know, I'm going to swing it like it's a really, really heavy object, and I'm just going to bash, bash, bash. Or, you know, it's good that they put some blocks in, although the blocks are not at all longswordish and nothing like really, well, I suppose only vaguely like what we see in historical treatises. But they bash with the thing, and they don't use the point, they don't really use the reach or winding or binding against the blade. They don't really do any of the things actually, or any of the interesting things that we see in historical treatises or manuals for the use of the longsword, of which we have dozens. Okay, we've got dozens of these, and we know how long swords were used, but it's very clear that the fight choreographer didn't have a clue how long swords were used, and they must be very, very heavy and just used for bashing with, you know, like they weren't sharp, like they didn't have a point at the end. So my principal criticism here is they don't think about how this weapon might have been used. And the fact is that we have seen, if we're kind of trying to suspend disbelief here, we have seen that these two characters know how to fence. And they know how to fence with épée, and they know how to fence more or less-ish with sabre. So why wouldn't they know how to fence with a longsword? Yes, it's a very different weapon. You've got two hands on the blade. You don't have much of a handguard apart from a cross. It's got two edges instead of one. But, you know, it's got a point, it's got edges. They understand how to land thrusts, for example. And I know people in tournaments and in competition who are from principally modern fencing or indeed rapier, historical rapier fencing backgrounds, who've entered longsword tournaments and basically just used them as thrusting implements. And it works fine. In fact, in terms of medically speaking, if you stab someone with one of these, you're usually going to do them more harm than if you try and chop someone with one. And I do understand that in this particular scenario, some of you might be going, oh, but yes, but this is just they're like roughhousing, they're not actually trying to kill each other. Yeah, okay, I concede that, okay? And I realise that by the point you've got to this video, some of you will have already probably typed that criticism. And I do accept that in this case, the fighters aren't necessarily trying to kill each other. But we're also supposed to assume, I mean, we see that they're wounding each other. We're supposed to assume that they are so skilled that they are landing hits on the opponent, or showing that they can land hits on the opponent whilst not actually killing them. And you can absolutely end up with your point online at a person in such a way that it's a bit like a submission, submission hold, but with a point, with a thrust basically on them, showing them that you can thrust them, but then you just don't follow through with the action. So absolutely, I think they should have shown more thrusting with these longswords, and not just repeating this old kind of trope, this stale old idea that longswords are really heavy bludgeoning instruments that don't have two edges and a point and lots of options for how to use them. Did you notice that longsword's so slow to swing that someone can actually run up some stairs in the time it takes to avoid that swing? Wow! Spinning! Spinning in sword fights. Why spinning? You don't find spinning in historical fencing treatises for a very good reason. If you're within hitting range, or at least one step or one lunge range of an opponent, turning your back on them, not the best idea in the world. So yeah, it kind of looks fun, and it looks silly actually, but it looks fun, and maybe to some people it looks convincing. And yes, indeed, I do understand that there are some types of spinning attack in unarmed martial arts with punching and kicking that indeed do work and can pay off. And I'm not saying that you could never do it as a special thing in a sword fight, but generally speaking, it's a really bad idea. And as someone who trains people to fight in tournaments and to spar and fight competitively, I would never advise someone to turn their back on their opponent in the middle of a fight, because the risk is just too great when you're not wearing armour and you're dealing with sharp weapons. Even by accident, you could spin onto the opponent's point. Even if the opponent's got no skill and no training, and they see someone spinning, what's happening? And they just stick their point out, you don't have your sword in front of you to defend from that, or bind against it, or do anything to it, because you're spinning around. So, spinning. That's my last major, big criticism of this fight. But I have to say, and I have to concede, we do find it in loads and loads of movies and TV shows. Spinning is popular, and I guess spinning's probably here to stay. Now, I don't want to keep you here for longer than necessary, but there are some positive things in this fight, and I'm going to run through those with you because I don't want you to think that I only see the negative in fights like this. In fact, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do think this was kind of fun, and I do quite like Pierce Brosnan as an actor. He certainly wasn't my favourite Bond, but I quite like him, and I quite like Toby Stephens, brilliant in Black Sails, and clearly he went on to actually do lots of sword fighting in his later career, as we found out. And I actually quite like the interplay between these two characters, and I quite like how it worked in terms of the movie, even though the movie's certainly not the best Bond film. I do quite like this scene as a whole. Now, there are some positive things you can specifically say about the swordplay as well. What I would say overall is my impression is that the fight choreographer probably used doubles for the kind of modern fencing bits, the bits with the épées, and you know, I have no real criticism of that at all. There's nothing that I could criticise there. It looked good, and I suspect that the fight choreographer, that's where their real strength was in modern fencing. As a result, we have to say that when they switched to the military sabres, the difference between modern sport, so Olympic style sabre, and historical sabre is notable. There are some notable differences, but it's not huge. The systems are interrelated. So I actually think that overall, the way they used the sabres, if you want to call them that, or cut and thrust swords, the officers' swords, the way they used them in this was not terrible. Yeah, they didn't thrust enough. Yeah, they didn't lunge enough. Yes, it was very sort of cinematographic, but I did quite like the way that they advanced and retired, some of the way that they managed distance. I also, you'll notice if you've watched other of my movie fight reviews, you'll notice that I often criticise the fact that the fighters are out of distance when they're giving attacks. And I have to say, by and large, in this fight scene, perhaps because they used a real fencing coach, I don't know, they do actually seem to have the distance right. So when they're giving attacks, they do actually look like they could land. They look like they are in distance. Now, whether that's because it's been filmed cleverly with the angles, or whether it's because they are actually just striking into distance, which I think they probably are a lot of the time. So I think the movement, the advancing and retiring, even though they don't lunge enough, and there are some lunges in there, which is again commendable because there are plenty of movies where they just don't lunge at all. So they've got some lunges, they've got good advancing and retiring, some nice moving around and using with the set, and their distance management seems pretty damn good, I have to say, for a movie. The second positive thing I want to say is throughout this fight, they don't just fixate on the bits of a sword that a modern fencer might do, for example. So they're not just thinking about cutting and thrusting, they use the hilts. Numerous times we see the use of the pommel and the guard, and same with the longsword. So that's absolutely fantastic, and that absolutely tallies with what we see in real combat accounts, of course, but also in historical fencing sources. So in historical fencing, absolutely we have techniques where you might punch with the guard or strike with the pommel. Certainly with longsword, there's all sorts of use for the pommel and the cross guard, and even the grip as well, to put into like locks, arm locks and stuff. So there's all sorts of uses of the hilt because it's a weapon, and actually, you know, any sort of way that you can use this weapon in the scenario to win is valid. Obviously there's some stupid ideas, but anything that works basically is good. So I really like the fact they were quite creative about how they used the weapons. Finally, I want to say that overall, did I find the fight fun? Yeah, I did. And I was a bit surprised by that. So I came into this because this is a movie that, as I say, this is a movie fight that I've been asked over the course of years to review, actually. and always by people who say, oh, this is terrible, you should slate this. And actually overall, I think I kind of have slated the things which need to be slated. But actually, I was pleasantly surprised. I was pleasantly surprised by how many good things there are in there, particularly to do with the distance management and the movement, the general look of fencing. But also the fact that they use the whole weapons. And overall also, I did find it fun. I didn't expect to enjoy this fight, and I actually kind of did. Even the, standing on a chair and using bits of the surroundings. This is what you expect. This is old school dueling. This is what we expect of Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone and Tyrone Power. This is a sword fight from the classical era of movie making, which largely has been lost now. And if we look at lots of modern series like Game of Thrones or more recent movies, a lot of the time you actually don't see very much of the fight because there's handheld camera and you cut so much. You cut with lots of close-ups. You can't actually see the overall fight and the distance management and everything else unless you're very, very sharp-eyed and you look at it on repeat as I have to when I'm doing these reviews. So in actual fact, I think it harks back to an age of the golden age of movie making. And I respect them for that, even if it's certainly the longsword part of it, which is a complete nonsense. But even if some parts of the fight aren't historically correct, I respect what they were trying to do, and I think they partially succeeded. Is it as good as Errol Flynn's Robin Hood? Is it as good as Basil Rathbone in Zorro? No, it's not. Okay, it's not as technically achieved, and it's not as impressive, frankly. But it's not bad. It's quite good from entertainment terms. So I hope you've enjoyed watching my movie fight review of Die Another Day. This is a movie, I'll probably have to go back and watch the whole movie now, which I haven't done for a while. I remember it not being great, but your comments and input are always welcome below here. Share this video around if you've enjoyed it, please. Give us a like and a subscribe, and you'll find me back here on this channel again with other weapons and fighting related videos, including more movie fight reviews. And if you haven't seen all of my previous ones, check out the playlist here for movie and TV fight reviews. Thanks for watching. I've been Matt Easton and I'll see you again soon. Cheers folks.